The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 6, Side 2. 5. The Syrians. Northward along the coast lay the ancient cities of Phoenicia, part with Palestine of the province of Syria. Their industrious workers, skilled in handicrafts, their favored position as traditional ports of trade, their rich and subtle merchants sending ships and agents everywhere, had kept them alive through all the vicissitudes of 1,000 years. Tyre, now Sur, had taller dwellings than Rome's and worse slums. It stank with the smell of its dying establishments, but it consoled itself with the thought that the whole world bought its richly colored textiles, above all its purple silks. Sidon had probably discovered the art of blowing glass, and now specialized in glass and bronze. Berytus, now Beirut, was distinguished for its schools of medicine, rhetoric, and law. Very likely from this university the great jurists Ulpian and Papinian went to Rome. No province of the empire passed Syria in industry and prosperity. Where now 3 million inhabitants find a precarious existence, 10 million lived in Trajan's time. 100 cities here enjoyed the pure water, the public baths, the underground drainage system, the clean markets, the gymnasia and palestras, the lectures and music, the schools and temples and basilicas, the porticos and arches, the public statuary and picture galleries, characteristic of the Hellenistic cities in the 1st century after Christ. The oldest of them was Damascus, over the Lebanons from Sidon, fortified by the surrounding desert and turned almost into a garden by the spreading arms and tributaries of a stream gratefully called the River of Gold. Many caravan routes converged here and poured into the bazaars the products of 3 continents. Returning over the anti-Lebanon hills and moving north over dusty roads, the modern traveler is astonished to find, in the tiny village of Baalbek, the ruins of 2 majestic temples and a propylaeum, once the pride of Heliopolis, the Greco-Roman Syrian city of the sun. Augustus planted a small colony there, and the town grew as the sacred seat of Baal the sun god, and as the meeting point of roads to Damascus, Sidon, and Beirut. Under Antoninus Pius and his successors, Roman, Greek, and Syrian architects and engineers raised, on the site of an old Phoenician temple to Baal, an imposing shrine to Jupiter Heliopolitanus. It was built of huge monoliths from a quarry a mile away. 1 block measures 62 by 14 by 11 feet and contains enough stone for a commodious house. 51 marble steps, 150 feet wide, lead up to the propylaeum, a Corinthian portico. Beyond a colonnaded forecourt and court rose the main temple, of which 58 columns still tower 62 feet into the air. Near it are the remains of a smaller temple, variously attributed to Venus, Bacchus, and Demeter. 19 of its columns survive, and a handsome portal delicately carved. Resplendent in their solitary grandeur under the unclouded sun, the columns of these temples are among the fairest extant works of man. Seeing them we feel, better than in Italy, the grandeur that was Rome, the wealth and courage, skill and taste that could build in so many scattered cities temples greater and more majestic than the crowded capital ever knew. A similar sight meets the traveler who strikes eastward across the desert from Homs, the ancient Emesa, to Tadmor, which the Greeks translated into Palmyra, city of a myriad palms. Its fortunate position and fertile soil around 2 gushing springs on the roads from Emesa and Damascus to the Euphrates made it grow in affluence until it was one of the major cities of the East. And its distance from other settlements enabled it to maintain practical independence despite nominal allegiance to Seleucid kings or Roman emperors. Its wide central thoroughfare was flanked by shady porticos containing 454 columns, and at the 4 main crossings were stately arches, of which one remains to let us judge the rest. The glory of the city was the Temple of the Sun, dedicated in A.D. 30 to the supreme trinity of Bel, or Baal, Yarhebal, the sun, and Aglebal, the moon. Its size continued Assyrian traditions of immensity. Its court, the largest in the empire, had an unrivaled colonnade 4,000 feet long, much of it composed of Corinthian columns running 4 abreast. Within the court and the temple were paintings and sculptures whose extant examples reveal the approach of Palmyra to Parthia in art as in geography. The main route eastward from Palmyra reached the Euphrates at Dura Europus. There, in A.D. 100, the merchants shared their gains with the Palmyrene Trinity by rearing a temple half Greek and half Indian. And an Eastern painter adorned the walls with frescoes that vividly illustrate the Oriental origin of Byzantine and early Christian art. Farther north on the great river were other important crossing towns at Thapsacus and Zeugma. Turning westward from Thapsacus, the traveler passed through Berea, now Aleppo, and Apamea to the Mediterranean at Laodicea, still keeping its ancient name as Latakia and still an active port. Between it and Apamea the river Orontes flowed north, between shores largely preempted by rich estates, to Antioch, now Antakya, capital of Syria. The river and a great network of roads brought the goods of the east to Antioch, while its Mediterranean port, Seleucia Pieria, 14 miles down the stream, brought in the products of the west. Most of the city rose on a mountain slope and had the Orontes at its feet. It was a picturesque location that helped Antioch rival Rhodes as the most beautiful city of the Hellenic East. It had a system of street lighting that made it safe and brilliant at night. The main avenue, 4.5 miles long, was paved with granite and had a covered colonnade on either side, so that people could walk from one end of the town to the other, immune to rain and sun. Pure water was supplied in abundance to every home. The complex population of 600,000 Greeks, Syrians, and Jews was notoriously gay, pursuing pleasure relentlessly, laughing at the pompous Romans who came to govern them, oscillating between the circus and the amphitheater, the brothels and the baths, and taking full advantage of Daphne, their famous suburban park. Festivals were numerous, and Aphrodite had a share in all of them. During the Feast of Brumalia, lasting through most of December, the whole city, says a contemporary, resembled a tavern, and the streets rang all night with song and revelry. There were schools of rhetoric, philosophy, and medicine, but Antioch was not a center of learning. Its populace lived intensely for the day, and when it needed religion it flocked to astrologers, magicians, miracle workers, and charlatans. The general picture of Syria under Roman rule is one of prosperity more continuous than in any other province. Most of the workers were freemen, except in domestic service. The upper classes were Hellenized, the lower remained Oriental. In the same town, Greek philosophers rubbed elbows with temple prostitutes and emasculated priests. And even till Hadrian, children were now and then offered as sacrifices to the gods. Sculpture and painting took on a semi-Oriental, half-medieval face and form. The Greek language prevailed in government and literature, but native tongues, chiefly Aramaic, remained the speech of the people. Scholars were plenty and made the world ring with their moment's fame. Nicolaus of Damascus, besides mentoring Antony, Cleopatra, and Herod, undertook the weary task of writing a universal history, a labor, he tells us, that Hercules himself would have shunned. Time in its tenderness has buried all his works, as at its leisure it will cover ours. 6. Asia Minor. North of Syria was the client kingdom, later the province, of Commagene, with a populous capital at Samosata, Lucian's childhood home. Across the Euphrates stood the little realm of Osrhoene. Rome fortified its capital, Edessa, now Urfa, as a base against Parthia. We shall hear more of it in Christian days. Westward from Syria, one passed into Cilicia, as now into Turkey, at Alexandria Issi, now Alexandretta. This, Cicero's province, was highly civilized along the southern Asia Minor coast, but still barbarous in the Taurus hills. Tarsus, the capital, was no mean city, said its son St. Paul, but was renowned for its schools and philosophers. Over against Cilicia, in the Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus pursued its immemorial life of mining copper, cutting cypress, building ships, and bearing patiently a succession of conquerors. The lucrative mines were owned by Rome and worked by slaves. Galen describes how in his time a mine there collapsed and crushed hundreds of workers, a periodical incident in the geological basis of human comforts and powers. North of Cilicia lay arid and mountainous Cappadocia, mining precious metals and raising wheat, cattle, and slaves for export. West of it, Lycaonia would enter into history with the visits of St. Paul to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. Again north was Galatia, settled and named by the Gauls in the 3rd century B.C., Its most famous product was the black stone of Pacinus, sent to Rome as a symbol of Cybele. Its chief city was Ancyra, capital of the Hittites 3,500 years ago and of Turkey today. West of Cilicia, the province of Pisidia counted fine cities within its borders, like Xanthus, now recovering from its mass suicide before Brutus, and Aspendus, whose theatre is so well preserved that one easily imagines it filling again to hear Menander or Euripides. West and north of Pisidia was the province of Asia, divided into Phrygia, Caria, Lydia, and Mysia. Here, where the civilization of Ionia still flourished after 1,000 years, Philostratus counted 500 towns, with a total population far greater than the region supports today. The countryside was fertile, the crafts had grown in skill from age to age, and the ports profited from the development of rich markets in Italy, Africa, Spain, and Gaul. Phrygia was mountainous, but it boasted large cities like Apamea Salini, ranked by Strabo as second only to Ephesus in Asia, and Laodicea, fortunate in its philanthropic philosophers and millionaires. Cnidus was yet important enough to make an alliance with Rome, but Halicarnassus had declined from Herodotus to Dionysius, an excellent literary critic, an uncritical historian. Miletus was no longer in its prime, though still an active port. The oracle of Apollo in the temple at nearby Didyma continued to answer questions with puzzles, and the storytellers of the region were weaving those amorous, picaresque Milesian tales that would soon develop into the Greek novel. Priene was a minor town, but its citizens vied honorably in making it fair with fine buildings. Here, in the 1st century B.C., a woman, Phyle, was elected to the highest municipal office. The influence of wealth and Rome was raising the status of woman in Hellenic lands. Magnesia on the Meander had what many rated as the most nearly perfect temple in Asia, dedicated to Artemis in 129 B.C. and designed by Hermogenes, the supreme architect of the age. At Mycale, the koinon, or commons, still met annually as a general council and religious union for Ionia. Of the islands lying off the Carian coast, Kos prospered with its silk industry and its medical school, rich with traditions of Hippocrates, and Rhodes, that is, the Rose, was even in her decline the most beautiful city of the Greek world. When, after the Civil War, Augustus sought to relieve the distress of the eastern cities by allowing the cancellation of all debts, Rhodes refused to avail herself of the expedient and met all her obligations faithfully. As a result, she rapidly regained her place as banker to the Aegean trade and became again a halfway port for vessels plying between Asia and Egypt. The city was celebrated for its fallen colossus, its handsome buildings, its famous statuary, its clean and orderly streets, its competent aristocratic government, its celebrated schools of rhetoric and philosophy. Here Apollonius Molo taught Caesar and Cicero those arts of style which through them influenced all later Latin prose. The most famous Rhodian of this period was Posidonius, the last great synthetic mind of antiquity. Born at Syrian Apamea in 135 B.C., he first earned fame as a long-distance runner. After studying under Panetius in Athens, he made Rhodes his home, served as her magistrate and ambassador, traveled into many provinces, returned to Rhodes, and drew such men as Pompey and Cicero to his lectures on the Stoic philosophy. At 83, he went to live in Rome and died there a year later. His lost universal history, covering Rome and its possessions from 144 to 82 B.C., was ranked by ancient scholars as equal to the work of Polybius. His report of his travels in Gaul and his treatise On the Ocean were basic sources for Strabo. His calculation of the sun's distance from the earth, 52 million miles, was closer than that of any other ancient student to our modern reckoning. He went to Cadiz to study the tides and explained them by the joint action of the sun and the moon. He underestimated the distance across the Atlantic and predicted that one sailing from Spain would come to India after 8,000 miles. Despite his wide acquaintance with natural science, he accepted many of the spiritualistic ideas of his time: daimones, divination, astrology, telepathy, and the power of the soul to rise to a mystic union with God, whom he defined as the life force of the world. Cicero too generously ranked him as the greatest of the Stoics. We might also consider him a forerunner of the Neoplatonists, a bridge from Zeno to Plotinus. Following the coast of Asia northward from Caria, the traveler entered Lydia and its greatest city, Ephesus. It flourished under the Romans as never before. Though Pergamum was the formal capital of Asia, Ephesus became the seat of the Roman proconsul and his staff. It was also the main port of the province and the meeting place of the provincial assembly. Its polyglot population of 225,000 ranged from philanthropic sophists to a noisy and superstitious rabble. The streets were well paved and lighted and had miles of shady porticos. There were the usual public buildings, some unearthed as late as 1894, a museum or scientific center, a medical school, a library with a strangely Baroque facade, and a theater that seated 56,000 persons. Here Demetrius the image-maker would arouse the populace against St. Paul. The center and chief bank of the city was the Temple of Artemis, surrounded by 128 columns, each the gift of a king. The eunuch priests were attended by virgin priestesses and a swarm of slaves. The rites were a mixture of Oriental and Greek. The barbarous statue that represented the goddess had 2 rows of supernumerary breasts, symbolizing fertility. The festival of Artemis made all May a month of rejoicing, feasting, and games. Smyrna, despite its fishermen, had a better atmosphere. Apollonius of Tyana, who traveled far and wide, called it the most beautiful city under the sun. It was proud of its long, straight streets, its double-tiered colonnades, its library, and its university. One of its most famous sons, Aelius Aristides, who lived from AD 117 to 187, described it in terms that reveal the splendor of these Roman Hellenistic cities. Go from east to west, and you will pass from temple to temple and from hill to hill along a street fairer than its name, the Golden Way. Stand on the Acropolis. The sea flows beneath you, the suburbs lie about you, the city, through 3 lovely views, fills the goblet of your soul. Everything to the very shore is a shining mass of gymnasia, markets, theaters, baths, so many that you hardly know where to bathe, fountains and public walks, and running water in every home. The abundance of her spectacles, contests, and exhibitions is beyond telling, and the variety of her handicrafts. Of all cities, this is best suited for those who like to live at ease and be philosophers without guile. Aelius was one of many rhetors and sophists whose fame drew students to Smyrna from all Hellas. His teacher, Polemo, was so great, says Philostratus, that he talked with cities as his inferiors, with emperors as not his superiors, and with the gods as his equals. When he lectured in Athens, Herodes Atticus, his greatest rival in opulent eloquence, attended as an admiring pupil. In payment for the privilege, Herodes sent him 150,000 drachmas, or $90,000. When Polemo failed to thank him, a friend suggested that he felt underpaid. Herodes sent 100,000 more, which Polemo quietly accepted as his due. Polemo used his fortune to embellish his adopted city. He took part in its government, harmonized its factions, and served as its ambassador. Tradition says that finding his arthritis unbearable, he shut himself up in the tomb of his ancestors at Laodicea and died of voluntary starvation at the age of 56. Sardis, Croesus's ancient capital, was still a great city in Strabo's time. Cicero was impressed by the splendor and refinement of Mytilene, and in the 3rd century Longus described it in terms suggestive of Venice. Pergamum shone with the great altar and costly buildings raised by the Attalid kings out of a treasury fattened by the labor of slaves in state forests, fields, mines, and factories. Attalus III anticipated Roman expansion and social revolution by bequeathing his realm to Rome in 133 BC. Aristonicus, son of King Eumenes II by a concubine, denounced the bequest as forced, called the slaves and the free poor to revolt, defeated a Roman army in 132, captured many cities, and planned a socialist state with the help of Blasius, teacher of the Gracchi. The neighboring kings of Bithynia and Pontus, and the business classes of the occupied cities joined Rome in suppressing the rebellion, and Aristonicus died in a Roman dungeon. This uprising, with the Mithridatic Wars, interrupted the cultural life of Pergamum for half a century, and Antony despoiled its famous library to reimburse Alexandria for the volumes burned during Caesar's stay. Pergamum must have recovered by Vespasian's time, for the elder Pliny judged it the most brilliant city in Asia. It enjoyed a new flurry of building under the Antonines, and developed in its Asclepium a medical school from which Galen went forth to cure the world. Farther north, Alexandria Troas was made a Roman colony by Augustus in memory of Rome's supposed Trojan origin, which gave Rome a convenient claim to all these parts. On a nearby hill, now Hisarlik, Old Troy was rebuilt as New Ilium and became a goal for tourists to whom guides pointed out the exact spot of every exploit in the Iliad, and the cave where Paris had judged Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. On the Propontis, Cyzicus built ships and sent out a ubiquitous merchant fleet rivaled only by that of Rhodes. Here Hadrian built a temple of Persephone, which was one of the glories of Asia. Its columns, says Dio Cassius, were 6 feet in diameter and 75 feet high, yet each was a single block of stone. Rising from a hill, it towered so high that Aelius counted the harbor's lighthouse superfluous. From the Red to the Black Sea, 100 cities flourished under the Roman peace. 7. The Great Mithridates. Along the northern shores of Asia Minor sprawled Bithynia and Pontus, mountainous in the interior but rich in timber and minerals. Here a mixture of Thracians, Greeks, and Iranians overlay an antique Hittite stock. A line of Greco-Thracian kings ruled Bithynia, built a capital at Nicomedia and major cities at Prusa and Nicaea. About 302 BC, a Persian noble, piously called Mithridates, carved a kingdom for himself out of Cappadocia and Pontus, and founded a dynasty of virile Hellenizing monarchs with capitals at Comana and Sinope. Their rule spread until it impinged upon Roman economic and political interests. The resulting Mithridatic Wars are fitly named from the redoubtable king who united Western Asia and European Greece in a revolt which, if it had succeeded, would have changed the face of history. Mithridates VI had inherited the throne of Pontus as a boy of 11. His mother and his guardians, seeking to supplant him, tried to kill him. He fled from the palace, disguised himself, and for 7 years lived in the woods as a hunter dressed in skins. About 115 BC, a coup d'état deposed his mother and restored him to power. Surrounded by the conspiracies characteristic of Oriental courts, he took the precaution of drinking a little poison every day until he had developed immunity to most of the varieties available to his intimates. In the course of his experiments, he discovered many antidotes. From these, his interest spread to medicine, on which he compiled data of such value that Pompey had them translated into Latin. His wild and exacting life had given him strength of body as well as of will. He grew to so large a frame that he sent his suit of armor to Delphi to amuse the worshippers. He was an expert horseman and warrior, could, we are assured, run fast enough to overtake a deer, drove a 16-horse chariot, and rode 120 miles in a day. He prided himself on being able to out-eat and out-drink any man, and he attended to a numerous harem. Roman historians tell us that he was cruel and treacherous and slew his mother, his brother, 3 sons, and 3 daughters. But Rome has not transmitted his side of this tale. He was a man of some culture, could speak 22 languages, and never used an interpreter. He studied Greek literature, was fond of Greek music, enriched Greek temples, and had Greek scholars, poets, and philosophers at his court. He collected works of art and issued coins of surpassing excellence. But he shared in the sensuality and coarseness of his half-barbarian environment and accepted the superstitions of his time. He defended himself against Rome, not with the far-seeing maneuvers of a great general or statesman, but with the impromptu courage of an animal at bay. Such a man could not be content with the reduced kingdom relinquished by his mother. With the help of Greek officers and mercenaries, he conquered Armenia and the Caucasus, passed over the Kuban River and the Strait of Kerch into the Crimea, and brought under his sway all the Greek cities on the east, north, and west coast of the Black Sea. As the collapse of Greek military power had left these communities almost defenseless against the barbarians of their hinterland, they received the Greek phalanxes of Mithridates as saviors. The subject cities included Sinope, Trapezus, Panticapaeum, and Byzantium, but Bithynian control of the Hellespont, now the Dardanelles, left the Mediterranean commerce of Pontus at the mercy of hostile kings. When he had died in 94 BC, his 2 sons contested the succession. One of them sought the aid of Rome, the other, Socrates, appealed to the Pontic king. Mithridates took advantage of the factional strife in Italy to invade Bithynia and enthrone Socrates. Rome, unwilling to see the Bosporus in hostile hands, ordered Mithridates and Socrates out of Bithynia. Mithridates complied, Socrates refused. The Roman governor of Asia deposed him and crowned Nicomedes III. The new ruler, encouraged by the Roman proconsul Manius Aquilius, invaded Pontus, and the First Mithridatic War began, from 88 to 84 BC. Mithridates felt that his sole chance of survival lay in arousing the Hellenic East to revolt against its Italian overlords. He announced himself as the liberator of Hellas and sent troops to free the Greek cities of Asia, if necessary by force. Opposed by the business classes of the towns, he courted the democratic parties with promises of semi-socialistic reforms. Meanwhile, his navy of 400 ships destroyed the Roman Black Sea fleet, and his army of 290,000 men overwhelmed the forces of Nicomedes and Aquilius. To express his scorn of Roman avarice, the victorious king poured molten gold down the throat of the captured Aquilius, fresh from his triumph over the revolted slaves of Sicily. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, shorn of Roman defense, opened their gates to the armies of Mithridates and declared their allegiance to his cause. At his suggestion, on an appointed day, they slew all Italians, 80,000 men, women, and children, whom they found within their walls, this in 88 BC. Says Appian, The Ephesians tore away the fugitives who had taken refuge in the temple of Artemis and were clasping the images of the goddess, and slew them. The Pergamenes shot with arrows the Romans who had sought sanctuary in the temple of Aesculapius. The people of Andromitium followed into the sea those who sought to escape by swimming, and killed them and drowned their children. The inhabitants of Caunus in Caria pursued the Italians who had taken refuge about the statue of Vesta, killed the children before their mothers' eyes, then the mothers, then the men, by which it was made plain that it was as much hatred of the Romans as fear of Mithridates that impelled these atrocities. Doubtless the poorer classes who had borne the brunt of Roman domination took the lead in this mad massacre. The propertied classes, long protected by Rome, must have trembled at so wild an uprising of revenge. Mithridates sought to appease the well-to-do by exempting the Greek cities from taxes for 5 years and giving them complete home rule. At the same time, however, he proclaimed the cancelling of debts, says Appian, freed the slaves, confiscated many estates, and redistributed the land. Leading men in the communities formed a conspiracy against him. He discovered it and had 1,600 of them killed. The lower classes, aided by philosophers and university professors, seized power in many Greek cities, even in Athens and Sparta, and declared war against both Rome and wealth. The Greeks of Delos, in an ecstasy of freedom, slaughtered 20,000 Italians in one day. The fleet of Mithridates captured the Cyclades. His armies took possession of Euboea, Thessaly, Macedonia, and Thrace. The defection of rich Asia stopped the flow of tribute to the Roman treasury and of interest to Roman investors, and plunged Italy into a financial crisis that had something to do with the revolutionary movement of Saturninus and Cinna. Italy itself was divided, for the Samnites and Lucanians sent offers of alliance to the Pontic king. Faced with war and revolution everywhere, the Senate sold the accumulated gold and silver of Rome's temples to finance Sulla's troops. We must not tell again how Sulla captured Athens, defeated the rebel armies, saved the empire for Rome, and gave Mithridates a lenient peace. The king withdrew to his Pontic capital and quietly organized another army and fleet. Murena, the Roman legate in Asia, decided to attack him before he grew stronger. When, in this second Mithridatic war, from 83 to 81, Murena was defeated, Sulla reprimanded him for violating the treaty and ordered hostilities ended. 6 years later, Nicomedes III bequeathed Bithynia to Rome. Mithridates realized that his own kingdom would soon be swallowed up if the Roman power, already controlling the Bosporus, should reach the borders of Paphlagonia and Pontus. In the Third Mithridatic War, from 75 to 63, he made a last effort, fought for 12 years against Lucullus and Pompey, was betrayed by his allies and aides, and fled to the Crimea. There the old warrior, now in his 69th year, tried to organize an army to cross the Balkans and invade Italy from the north. His son, Pharnaces, revolted against his authority, his army refused the venture, and the deserted king tried to kill himself. The poison that he took failed to work because he had inured his system to it, and his hands were too weak to press home the blade from whose point he invited death. His friends and protégés, commissioned by his son to kill him, ended his life with their swords and spears. 8. Prose. It speaks well for Roman rule that the cities of Asia Minor recovered so rapidly from the intermittent fever of these wars. Nicomedia became the capital of the province of Bithynia Pontus and later the imperial seat of Diocletian. Nicaea would be immortalized by the most important council in the history of the Christian Church. The two cities so rivaled one another in building that Trajan had to send the younger Pliny to draw them back from bankruptcy. Nicomedia made her offering to literature in Flavius Arrianus, whom we have seen recording the discourses of Epictetus. Governor of Cappadocia for 6 years, Archon of Athens for 1, Arrian yet found time to write many histories, of which only the Anabasis of Alexander remains, with an appendix of Indica. It was written in clear and simple Greek, for Arrian took Xenophon as his exemplar in style as well as life. This work, he says with the bold vanity of the ancients, is and has been from my youth up equivalent to native land and family and public office for me, and therefore I do not deem myself unworthy to rank among the greatest authors in the Greek language. Other cities along the Black Sea had goodly buildings and famous scholars. Myrleia had 320,000 inhabitants. Amastris impressed Pliny as a neat and lovely city, known for its fine box trees. Sinope flourished as a fishing center and an outlet for the timber and minerals of its countryside. Amasis and Trapezus made a living by trading across the waters with Scythia, and Amasea gave birth and a home to antiquity's most celebrated geographer. Strabo came of a rich family, related, he assures us, to the Pontic kings. He suffered from a peculiar squint, still known by his name. He traveled extensively, apparently on diplomatic missions, and used every opportunity to gather geographical or historical information. He wrote a lost history continuing Polybius, and in 7 BC he issued his great Geography, of whose 17 books time has preserved nearly all. Like Arrian, he begins by proclaiming the virtues of his work. I ask pardon of my readers and appeal to them not to fasten the blame for the length of my discussion upon me, than upon those who earnestly desire knowledge of things famous and ancient. In this work I must leave untouched what is small, and devote my attention to what is noble and great, useful or memorable or entertaining. And just as, in judging the merits of colossal statues, we do not examine each individual part with minute care, but rather consider the general effect, so should this my book be judged, for it too is a colossal work, worthy of a philosopher. He borrows frankly from Polybius and Posidonius, less frankly from Eratosthenes, brings them all sharply to account for their errors, and suggests that his own should be blamed on his sources. But he acknowledges his sources with rare candor, and usually selects them with discrimination. He notes that the extension of the Roman Empire has widened geographical knowledge, but believes that there are whole continents still unknown, possibly in the Atlantic. He believes that the earth is spheroidal, but the word probably meant spherical, and that if one were to sail westward from Spain he would in time come to India. He describes coastlines as always changing through erosion or eruption, and conjectures that subterranean disturbances may someday sever Suez and unite the seas. His work was a brave summary of the global knowledge of his age, and must be ranked as one of the major achievements of ancient science. Far more renowned than Strabo in his time was Dio Chrysostom, Dio of the Golden Mouth, who lived from AD 40 to 120. His family had long been distinguished in Prusa. His grandfather had exhausted a fortune in gifts to the Bithynian city, and then had made another. His father had gone through the same experience, and Dio followed in their steps. He became an orator and a sophist, went to Rome, was converted to Stoicism by Musonius Rufus, and was banished from Italy and Bithynia by Domitian in 82. Forbidden the use of his property or income, he wandered for 13 years from country to country as a penniless philosopher, refusing money for his discourses and earning his bread for the most part by the work of his hands. When Domitian was succeeded by Nerva, Dio's exile was changed into honors. Nerva and Trajan befriended him and gave his city many favors at his request. He returned to Prusa and devoted most of his wealth to beautifying it. Another philosopher accused him of embezzling public funds. He was tried by Pliny and appears to have been exonerated. Dio left behind him 80 orations. For us today they contain more wind than meat. They suffer from empty amplifications, deceptive analogies, and rhetorical tricks. They stretch half an idea to half 100 pages. No wonder a weary listener complained, "You are letting the sun go down with your interminable questions." But the man had charm and eloquence, else he could hardly have become the most celebrated orator of the century, for whose speeches men would interrupt a war. "I don't know what you mean," said the honest Trajan, "but I love you as myself." The barbarians on the Borysthenes, now the Dnieper, heard him as gladly as the Greeks gathered at Olympia or the excitable Alexandrians. An army about to revolt against Nerva was mollified into acceptance by the impromptu address of the half-naked exile. Probably what drew people to him was not his fine Attic Greek, but the courage of his denunciations. Almost alone in pagan antiquity he condemned prostitution, and few writers of his time so openly attacked the institution of slavery. He was a bit vexed, however, when he found that his slaves had run away. His address to the Alexandrians was a castigation of their luxury, superstition, and vice. He chose Ilium as the scene of an oration in which he argued that Troy had never existed, and that Homer was the boldest liar in history. In the heart of Rome he expounded the case of the countryside against the city, painted in vivid narrative a touching picture of rural poverty, and warned his audience that the land was being neglected and the agricultural basis of civilization was in decay. At Olympia, amid a multitude of fanatical worldlings, he reproved the atheists and Epicureans of the day. "Although popular conceptions of duty may be absurd," said Dio, "the wise man will understand that the simple mind needs simple ideas and pictorial symbols." In truth, no man can conceive the form of the Supreme Being, and even Phidias's noble statue was an anthropomorphic assumption as unwarrantable as the primitive identification of God with a star or a tree. We cannot know what God is, but we have an innate conviction that he exists, and we feel that philosophy without religion is a dark and hopeless thing. The only real freedom is wisdom, that is, the knowledge of what is right and what is wrong. The road to freedom lies not through politics or revolution, but through philosophy. And true philosophy consists not in the speculations of books, but in the faithful practice of honor and virtue according to the dictates of that inmost voice which is, in some mystic sense, the word of God in the heart of man. 9. The Oriental Tide. Religion, which had bided its time and nourished its roots through all the learned or ribald skepticism of the Periclean and Hellenistic periods, now in the 2nd century resumed its immemorial sway, as philosophy, baffled by infinity and human hope, confessed its limitations and abdicated its authority. The people themselves had never lost their faith. Most of them accepted in outline the Homeric description of the afterlife, sacrificed religiously before undertaking a voyage, and still placed an obol in the mouth of the dead to pay his passage across the Styx. Roman statecraft welcomed the aid of established priesthoods and sought popular support by building costly temples to local gods. Throughout Palestine, Syria, and Asia Minor, the wealth of the clergy continued to grow. Hadad and Atargatis were still worshipped by the Syrians and had an awesome shrine at Hierapolis. The resurrection of the god Tammuz was still hailed in the towns of Syria with the cry, Adonis, that is, the Lord, is risen, and his ascension into heaven was celebrated in the closing scenes of his festival. Similar ceremonies commemorated in Greek ritual the agony, death, and resurrection of Dionysus. From Cappadocia, the worship of the goddess Ma had spread into Ionia and Italy. Her priests, called fanatici as belonging to the fanum or temple, danced dizzily to the sound of trumpets and drums, slashed themselves with knives, and sprinkled the goddess and her devotees with their blood. The making of new deities went on assiduously. Caesar and the emperors, Antinous and many local worthies were deified, that is, canonized, in life or death. Cross-fertilized by trade and war, pantheons were everywhere in flower, and prayers rose hopefully in 1,000 tongues to 1,000 gods. Paganism was not one religion. It was a jungle of rival creeds, often merging in eclectic confusion. The worship of Cybele held its ground in Lydia and Phrygia, Italy and Africa, and elsewhere, and its priests, as before, emasculated themselves in imitation of her beloved Attis. At her spring festival, her worshippers fasted, prayed, and mourned the death of Attis. Her priests cut their arms and drank their own blood, and a solemn procession bore the young god to his grave. But on the morrow the streets rang with exultant shouts as the people celebrated the resurrection of Attis and the renewal of the earth. "Take courage, O mystics," cried the priests. "The god is saved, and for you also will come salvation." On the last day of the feast the image of the Great Mother was carried in triumph through crowds that hailed her at Rome as Nostra Domina, Our Lady. Even more widely honored than Cybele was the Egyptian goddess Isis, the sorrowing mother, the loving comforter, the bearer of the gift of eternal life. All the Mediterranean peoples knew how her great spouse Osiris had died and had risen from the dead. In nearly every great city on that historic sea, this happy resurrection was commemorated with gorgeous pageantry, and jubilant worshippers sang, "We have found Osiris again." Isis was represented in pictures and statues as holding her divine child Horus in her arms, and devout litanies hailed her as Queen of Heaven, Star of the Sea, and Mother of God. Of all pagan cults, this came nearest to Christianity in the tenderness of its story, the refinement of its ritual, the solemnity and yet joyful atmosphere of its chapels, the moving music of its vespers, the conscientious ministry of its white-robed and tonsured priests, the honors and opportunities with which it charmed and comforted women, the universal welcome it gave to every nationality and class. The religion of Isis spread from Egypt to Greece in the 4th century B.C., to Sicily in the 3rd, to Italy in the 2nd, and then to all parts of the empire. Her icons have been found on the Danube, the Rhine, and the Seine, and a temple to her has been unearthed in London. The Mediterranean soul has never ceased to worship the divine creativeness and maternal solicitude of woman. Meanwhile, the masculine cult of Mithras was passing from Persia to the most distant Roman frontiers. In the later Zoroastrian theology, Mithras was the son of Ahura Mazda, the god of light. He, too, was the god of light, of truth, purity, and honor. Sometimes he was identified with the sun, and led the cosmic war against the powers of darkness. Always he mediated between his father and his followers, protecting and encouraging them in life's struggle with evil, lies, uncleanliness, and the other works of Ahriman, Prince of Darkness. When Pompey's soldiers brought this religion from Cappadocia to Europe, a Greek artist pictured Mithras as kneeling on the back of a bull and plunging a poniard into its neck. This representation became the universal symbol of the faith. The 7th day of each week was held sacred to the sun god, and towards the end of December his followers celebrated the birthday of Mithras, the invincible sun, who at the winter solstice had won his annual victory over the forces of darkness, and day by day would now give longer light. Tertullian speaks of a Mithraic priesthood with a high pontiff, and of celibates and virgins serving the god. Daily sacrifice was offered at his altar, worshippers partook of consecrated bread and wine, and the climax of the ceremony was signaled by the sounding of a bell. A flame was kept ever burning before the crypt in which the young god was represented felling the bull. Mithraism preached a high morality and pledged its soldiers to a lifelong war against evil in every form. After death, said its priests, all men must appear before the judgment seat of Mithras. Then unclean souls would be handed over to Ahriman for eternal torment, while the pure would rise through 7 spheres, shedding some mortal element at each stage, until they would be received into the full radiance of heaven by Ahura Mazda himself. This invigorating mythology spread in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era through Western Asia and Europe, skipping Greece, and built its chapels as far north as Hadrian's Wall. Christian fathers were shocked to find so many parallels between their own religion and Mithraism. They argued that these were thefts from Christianity or confusing stratagems of Satan, a form of Ahriman. It is difficult to say which faith borrowed from the other. Perhaps both absorbed ideas current in the religious air of the East. Each of the great cults of the Mediterranean region had mysteries, which were usually ceremonies of purification, sacrifice, initiation, revelation, and regeneration, centering about the death and resurrection of the god. New members were admitted into the worship of Cybele by being placed naked in a pit over which a bull was slain. The blood of the sacrificed animal falling upon the candidate purified him of sin and gave him a new spiritual and eternal life. The genitals of the bull, representing his sacred fertility, were placed in a consecrated vessel and were dedicated to the goddess. Mithraism had a similar rite, known to the classic world as Torabolium, or throwing of the bull. Apuleius described in ecstatic terms the degrees of initiation into the service of Isis, the long novitiate of fasting, continence, and prayer, the purifying submersion in holy water, and at last the mystic vision of the goddess offering everlasting bliss. At Eleusis, the candidate was required to confess his sins, which discouraged Nero, abstain for a time from certain foods, bathe in the bay for spiritual as well as physical cleansing, and then offer sacrifice, usually of a pig. For 3 days at the feast of Demeter, the initiates mourned with her the snatching of her daughter into Hades, and meanwhile lived on consecrated cakes and a mystic mixture of flower, water, and mint. On the 3rd night a religious drama represented the resurrection of Persephone, and the officiating priest promised a like rebirth to every purified soul. Varying the theme under Hindu or Pythagorean influence, the Orphic sect throughout the Greek lands taught that the soul is imprisoned in a succession of sinful bodies and can be released from this degrading reincarnation by rising to ecstatic union with Dionysus. At their gatherings, the members of the Orphic Brotherhood drank the blood of a bull sacrificed to and identified with the dying and atoning Savior. Communal partaking of sacred food or drink was a frequent feature of these Mediterranean faiths. Often the food was thought to take on, by sanctification, the powers of the god, which were then magically conveyed to the communicant. All sects assumed the possibility of magic. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.